right, while I pull up my screen. Welcome everyone. I'm going to just get my screen shared here as we're opening up. And are you able to see the slide deck as it's supposed to be seen? Okay, you just never know with Zoom how it's going to be shared. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. I am excuse me, my name is Sarah Arden. As Brad very generously introduced us, I'm from American Institutes for Research. There we go. And I'm here with my colleague, Teri Marx. And I think you can see her face, but there she is. We're here and we're actually representing two different federal centers, the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the Progress Center. We both work on both centers. So I'm not going to say, you know, it sort of gets tricky, but you will see we're going to share resources from both centers. The National Center on Intensive Intervention focuses just on that, on building capacity to support implementation of data-based individualization or intensive intervention for students with disabilities and students with intensive behavior and academic needs. The Progress Center focuses specifically on students with disabilities and really sort of supporting development and implementation of high quality education programs for kids with disabilities across all disability categories K-12. So we're going to talk quite a bit about that a little bit too, and we're going to share some resources from those centers. But really today, we're going to spend our time, Teri and I, doing some high level discussion around really sort of activating some background knowledge, talking about IEP goals and IEP goals as a way to drive instruction, and really how do we write and level set around high quality IEP goals. We're going to talk about your background knowledge. We're going to talk about connecting IEP goals to present levels. We're going to talk a little bit about writing goals, and then we're going to share some resources with you. So that's sort of the plan for today. Looks like the slides have been shared in the chat, so you have access to those. If you have questions as we go, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Teri and I will do our best to respond. We'll also share some resources there as we move along. Our objectives for today, excuse me, as soon as it gets pretty enough in Oregon, I'm actually based in Washington State. As soon as it gets pretty enough to go outside, as many of you know, we get allergies here. So I apologize for the coughing and sneezing that may happen over the next hour. So our objectives for today are just as laid out in this slide. Like I said, we're going to spend some time just going over some high level information, but really talking about what are the IDEA requirements for measurable annual goals. What is required, and then are there extra things out there? We find that there's a lot of sort of lore around IEPs, especially for those of you that have likely been special educators for a long time, maybe in your districts or in your state. I'm going to operate on the assumption that most of you are Oregon educators if you're here. Some of you may be from out of state, but sometimes there's these issues around what a district has always done because they've always done it. So we're going to really talk about sort of what are the IDEA requirements. We're going to talk about the role of measurable annual goals in the development of a high quality IEP, the 3 essential elements of those goals, give you a couple of tips for developing goals, and then share some resources for learning more about measurable goals. So before we get started, we're just going to give a little bit of background knowledge. And Teri, feel free to jump in as we move along. But really, we're going to ground this work in IDEA. And so in order to do that, we need to talk about what does IDEA say about measurable annual goals. And so the language in IDEA, and if you're someone who really wants to check this out or know where this is, it's in this sort of section 300.320 of IDEA, sort of says the following about measurable annual goals. It says that an IEP must contain the following: a statement of measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals. And just to remind you, for this presentation, we're going to really focus on academic goals, but this is also relevant for functional goals. And there's a whole bunch of information on a number of, especially the Progress Center's website, which we'll share with you. And we can throw that in the chat too, if you're interested on learning about more about functional goals too. But a statement of measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals, that's designed to A, meet the child's needs that result from the disability, to enable the child to be involved in and make progress towards the general ed curriculum, and B, meet the child's other educational needs that result from the child's disabilities. And Teri put the bookmark for the IDEA statutes and regulations there. So if you want to check out where those come from, you can check out that link. But that's what IDEA says. Something that's interesting, and depending on how long you've worked in special education and how long you've been writing IEP goals, you may remember a time when we wrote benchmarks for every single IEP goal for every single kid. Benchmarks or short-term objectives are required only for children with disabilities who take alternate assessments or aligned to alternate achievement standards. And you'll see that in the regulation language. That changed in the 2004 authorization, just so you know. But that's something that's interesting to see and that you may sort of encounter as, you know, depending on how your district or your state operates. Another important thing for us to point out is that all states must meet the minimum requirements set by IDEA. So that's these, right? IDEA says this is what has to be in there. You have to have an IEP that has a statement of measurable annual goals, that it have to include these things. But many states go above and beyond in establishing additional requirements for promotion of high quality education programs. So be sure to check your state's laws. In many cases, for those of you, that's Oregon, to see if there's additional requirements. The best example I can think of this is if you're an educator who has received an IEP from a student who has moved out of state, sometimes those IEPs look really different. Sometimes you work in a state that has additional really intensive requirements and you get them and you're like, whoa, that looks really different. Sometimes you work in a state that you have really intensive requirements and you get an IEP that you're like, whoa, they require nothing in this state. Like, what's happening? They have 2 goals that have these sort of minimal things, like this looks like nothing. So just know that states must meet the minimum, but many states have really different requirements above and beyond that. And that's normal, expected. We see variance like that across the board. Anything to add to that or questions about that from anyone? Okay. So why are IEP goals important? You can see this sort of flow, and we're going to talk really a little bit about present levels and really talk about IEP goals and some of these other components here. But measurable goals really describe what a student should be reasonably able to accomplish in a 12-month period. They're sort of our path, our framework, our roadmap. There's a whole bunch of analogies here that we can talk through and sort of lay out here. But they're really help the IEP team determine whether a student's making a progress appropriate to his or her circumstances. There really are sort of plan for what it is that we're doing over the year. They lay out our plan for the year. So before we move on and talk a little bit more about our present levels and how to write goals and what should go into them, we want to do a quick knowledge check. So in the chat box, what we would like you to do is mark any of these that apply. So if the answer is A, B, C, or D, you'll write A, B, C, D. If it's just A, you'll write A. So the question here is where it says number 1. According to IDEA, an IEP must include a statement of measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals designed to, and then select all that apply. So I'll read them to you, but meet a child's needs that result from the disability to enable the child to be involved in and make progress in a general ed curriculum. Define what a student can reasonably accomplish during the course of a semester. Measure a student's progress using benchmarks or short-term objectives, and meet each of the child's other educational needs that result from the child's disability. So we'll give everybody a minute, but tell me, which ones do you think
We've got a lot of A, some AC, and some ACDs coming through.
I see a couple of right answers. Well, I'm really glad that I don't see too many B's. And so that is automatically, we're going to do like what is it called with the house hunter, where we're going to cross off the options that we immediately know aren't right. So B, we're going to cross off, right, as a group. Define what a student can reasonably accomplish in the course of a semester. We're gonna immediately say that option is not for us, right? Because it's an annual goal, and B says semester. So we know that an IEP goal is annual, so it's a 12-month period versus a semester, which is usually 16 weeks or so. So we know B off the bat isn't right for us. So now we're left with A, C, and D. So the issue with C, and we mentioned this earlier, is that we don't actually have to have benchmarks or short-term objectives. Yeah, it's kind of tricky. This is kind of a trick question. C is sort of a depends, right? So it depends on the student for C. If we're talking about a student that is being measured against alternate achievement standards, you're right. Actually, Marisol, you're right on for that. If we're talking about a student that is being measured against alternate achievement standards, then we actually have to have benchmarks. But for all kids, for other kids, it's really A and D. And if you look back on that first slide that we have, and I'm not going to take us all the way back, that the statute language from IDEA matches A and D exactly, right? We need to have a goal that meets the child's needs based on their disability, that enables them to make progress in the general curriculum, and D meets the child's needs that result from the disability. So it's A and D were the right answers, but I can see where some of you thought C was in there because we're lumping in students who will have IEP goals based on their if they're being measured against other disabilities or alternate assessments. So I'm glad we didn't have too many B's. Excellent job.
I didn't see any.
I
Way to
didn't
go.
see any. So
Yeah.
bonus points for everyone. We all agreed that B was not the one for us. So excellent choice. Two other quick slides before we talk about PLAFs and I pass it over to Teri. Just a reminder, there is a Supreme Court case, and because I can't see all of your faces, I can't really get a sense of if you're all familiar with this. I'm assuming this has sort of been out in the zeitgeist for a while now, so I'm assuming there's some level of familiarity with this. But in 2017, there was a Supreme Court case around special education that was decided around the Andrew F. versus Douglas County. And a number of things sort of came out of the Supreme Court case, but one of the most critical was this vacation or sort of addressing the de minimis educational benefit standard, which was set in a different case in 1982, the Board of Education versus Rowley. And so, again, depending on how many of you have worked in special ed and for how long, this de minimis educational benefit standard really was sort of that students must make some progress, but it was sort of this notion of that, like how much progress is required for kids with disabilities. And Andrew F., this court case really pushed that decision and requires educators and school districts to think about the way that we calculate IEP goals and write IEPs a little bit different, right? And so it looks like, based on the chat, that some of you are pretty familiar with this and have done some thinking about it. We're not going to talk a ton about Andrew today, but we just want to remind you that this is out there. So the Andrew decision really requires that a school should offer an IEP. Both this reasonably calculated is really important for you to think through, and enables a child to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances. Reasonably calculated is really critical. That means we have to have really nice baseline information and really valid data that our goals are sort of grounded in, and that we really need to continue to push towards goals that are obtainable, but also that have really high standards. And this sort of excuse me, this de minimis education benefit that we're sort of pushing beyond that. So some more language around injuries to meet the substantive obligation under IDEA. Again, a school must offer an IEP that's reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the standards. So that's where the decision came from. And I appreciate Teri's sort of comment in the chat. It didn't overturn the Raleigh decision. It just further clarified that decision about what is meant by progress, vacating this de minimis decision and talking about reasonable calculation. So given that, I think it's important that we talk about present levels and the relationship between goals and PLAF. So I'm going to hand it over to Teri. Now, Teri, do you want to share slides or do you want me to just continue progressing?
You can continue progressing. I've got a nice flow on my screen where I don't have to then mess up and I can still see the chat and everything. So if folks are wanting to ask questions, we can both kind of view those easily.
Great.
So one of the things, and actually, Sarah, if you can go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So one of the things I'll highlight here is that that first sentence, some of you may be wondering, what is the substantive obligation, right? If you think about IDEA and you think about the various aspects of what IDEA is articulating, there are both procedural and substantive requirements. Our procedural requirements are the things like, do we have a goal in each area, right? Do we have a present level statement in all of the areas where those are where we have an identified need? Do we, did the parent sign off on this? Did we send prior notification? Like all of those procedural type things, that's that obligation, that's that requirement. The substantive obligation is the one where it's kind of the more gray matter, right? It's the progress domain. It's how we're measuring progress in the IEP. It's making sure that we are actually addressing the student's needs through this program that we've set out. So I wanted to highlight that most of us are typically trained in those procedural requirements, and we don't get as much training in the substantive piece of it. And so we're really trying to kind of push the envelope a little bit for folks to understand that we also have these substantive requirements under the law. And what we're going to be talking about in terms of moving from our present level statement through our goal writing to help drive instruction is that process can actually help us better articulate our obligation in that substantive domain than just writing a goal independent of actually looking across the program from beginning to end. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that and kind of point out that language, because within the development of our individualized education program, we do need to meet both procedural and substantive obligations under IDEA. Okay, we can skip forward. All right, so similar to how Sarah started us off with looking at the regulations and looking at the statute for measurable annual goals, we're now going to look at what those look like in our present level statements. So when we're thinking about our present levels, we're thinking about present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. These might be called different things, or if you've been around, you might hear them still referred to as our PLAP, right? Our present levels of performance. I mean, those of us that have been familiar with that language, I hear just present level statements. You know, there's a lot of different things that these are called, but under the regulation is present levels of academic achievement and functional performance that include that first part there, how the child's disability affects the child's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. So that's the same curriculum as for non-disabled children. And then for preschool children as appropriate, how the disability affects the child's participation in appropriate activities. Now, what I'll say is this is very couched in the language of an academic PLAF, just that portion of an academic PLAF. But what we want to also be thinking about in terms of involvement and progress in is their functional skills that are needed, right? And so if we're thinking about a comprehensive present level statement, we should be really thinking holistically about the child's needs in making progress in the general education curriculum, both in terms of their academic skills as well as those functional skills that they need to make progress. All right, so why is the PLAF important? What we need to be seeing is a direct relationship between the present levels of performance and the other components of the IEP, right? So our present levels are really driving how we're supposed to be putting together this entire program for a kid. And if you notice, I keep using the term individualized education program because that's the legal terminology. What we hear often in the field is plan. Our IEP is not just a plan, it is setting out a program of services for our children that is directly related to those individual needs. And so we're going all the way back to those present level statements to help us, and those are rooted in assessment, right? Those are going to come from either our assessments that we're using in terms of our eligibility determination. If we're at the annual goal stage, we might be looking at the data collected throughout the course of the previous academic year, any other data sources that are going to help us inform those present levels from which we are going to measure progress in those goals, right? Our present levels are going to establish a baseline of performance, and that's what we're going to look at in the next slide. So our baseline data for monitoring student progress. This is really what we need to be thinking about in terms, again, of that present level statement. So we have to have a baseline statement that is specific, objective, and measurable, right? Otherwise, how are we going to be able to ascertain whether or not the student has made progress and we've met our substantive compliance or our substantive obligations under IDEA? So accurate baseline data are critical for setting ambitious goals using those validated approaches and some of the validated approaches that we'll talk about. And in addition to our quantitative data, right, it's also important to include qualitative data, especially in terms of anything that the parent or family can provide us in terms of information, the student themselves can share with us, various educators, especially as we get into the secondary level. We need to be looking at that student's progress within each of those different content areas, even if it's not considered as a part of their one goal, right? We're looking at their access to the general education curriculum across those content areas. So it's important for us to have this really holistic understanding of the student's performance across the setting. And these data should really inform our instruction and our development of those measurable annual goals that Sarah kind of outlined a little bit ago. And then also help us to really tailor the services that we're going to put in place to ensure that that child does make progress and does actually result in progress toward and access to the general education curriculum. So using the baseline to inform the PLAF. What we want to kind of highlight here is that this information should directly align to what we're going to be putting into our goal statements as well. So the student's baseline score should be used when writing our PLAF statement and be very specific. So in that text box in the middle on this slide, it says, when given a standardized passage at the second grade level, Chris currently reads 55 words correct per minute with 93% accuracy. That tells us a lot of information. We know exactly what grade level the student is performing at, right? We know that he's been given standardized passages. We know that his current level of performance is 55 words correct per minute, and that he's accurate about 93% of the time, right? We have a lot of data within one short statement from which then we can write a measurable annual goal, right? And in addition to these quantitative data, we already talked about this, we might want to include some information about parent observations. Now, this in and of itself is not a full statement for a present level of academic achievement and functional performance, right? We could, and I see somebody's adding something about, there might be information that we need to include about comprehension, right? Again, we're going to go back to the individual student and say, what are the areas of need that we've identified through those assessments? And then we want to make sure that we're aligning our present level statement with where the assessment is identifying a student has a deficit or a need for services, right? And then we're going to be also pulling in any of the other statements around any of those assessments. So I was a school social worker. I did a lot more on the behavioral side. I'd also be bringing in some of those components related to a functional behavioral assessment, right? Looking at the frequency of occurrence of a student's behavior, maybe looking at the duration and intensity. All of that information can also inform our present level statement. So this is just one little snippet of an entire, we don't want you to get the impression that this in and of itself is a full and complete present level statement. However, for this one skill where we identified a need based off of the assessments that were given, this is a statement that's going to give us a lot of information from which we can then measure the progress against. And we're going to go through some guiding questions here around our baseline. And again, this is going to go for all of those areas of need. Are data being reviewed to determine whether the student is making progress specific, right? Are they clearly stated? Can anybody that picks up that IEP from state to state, from district to district, right, from school to school, because we know these practices, as Sarah mentioned before, we might get somebody else's IEP. Can we pick that up and go and implement it? Can we pick it up and understand exactly where that student was at? Are they objective, meaning observable? Do we actually have the ability to kind of observe what that child is doing? Is it measurable? And this goes for not just the goal, but again, we're talking about that present level statement as well. Is it a measurable statement? And can we then use that to help us determine the frequency in which we need to collect our data? And then do the data relate to identified areas of concern and our state content standards, right? So if we think about all of those different connections, again, if we think about our content standards, that's going to give us information about the student's progress within that general education curriculum. So just want to kind of highlight this as a potential checklist that you can use when you're thinking about your baseline, to make sure that you have these data sources and that you're developing a statement that, again, clearly articulates to anybody that picks up that document where that student is at, to serve as that baseline to help you then plan for that student through their IEP and their program.
And I think, Teri, to add to this, under this, does the data relate to this? Identified areas of concern is somewhere where I just think I would like to encourage you as educators, and we didn't ask you your roles, but depending on what your work is as you're developing these education programs for kids, to really think about, sometimes we get in the habit of creating goals around the kind of instruction we know we're going to deliver versus goals that really match present levels, or goals that match the identified areas of concern for the assessment. So we create reading goals because we're going to deliver reading instruction, and the reading goals are decoding and comprehension and multisyllable words because that's what they're going to get, or something like that, versus the other way around. So I would encourage you to think about that. And sometimes we'll hear folks say, well, we just need a really comprehensive reading goal. And I would say, well, we need a goal that matches the identified areas of concern. Same with mathematics. And so I think that it's a really sort of nuanced language and a nuanced approach. But I think, we don't want to leave areas off if it's in identified areas of concern, but we don't also want to just lump in these sort of general goals or general sort of present levels, because it matches like all kinds of instruction that we're going to deliver. And so that's just something to consider and think through as you move forward and really sort of dig through and maybe take a more serious look at your IEPs and the goals and the way that you're writing these moving forward.
Yeah, and I think the other piece there, Sarah, is if you think back to, for those of you, if you think back to the arrow where we start with PLAF and then we have our measurable annual goal, the other things that go along that path to help us, make that path to progress, we want to make sure that we are using it as a fluid way for us to kind of thinking about it in that linear progression. We have our baseline, we're setting our measurable annual goal. That's going to help inform the services that we need to provide, the level of support at which we need to provide those services, any accommodations or modifications, including accommodations during our testing, all of those different things that we typically, as Sarah was saying, tend to think about before we've actually thought about that present level. And I will give a personal example of this as a step parent of a child who has an IEP, when there's that disconnect and how that really kind of plays out. So there is an area of need identified for my stepson in terms of present levels written all over the place, social pragmatic language deficits. There is nothing in his IEP that is addressing those deficits. right? Because what they're doing is saying our services include X, Y, and Z. Here's how we can provide those services. Here's the goals. And he has a social skills goal, right? But that's not necessarily digging deep enough into what we're saying is the identified area of need. So we really need to make sure that we're bringing in those connections and saying, if this is an area of need, depending on whether or not we have vacancies in our speech and language pathologists to provide that service, we need to figure out a method to get that kid those services, right? And that's where that team decision comes into play. And that's where, if you look at the IDEA regulations, whoever is operating in terms of your LEA administrator needs to be somebody not just with knowledge of the general education curriculum and the individual student, but the third part in those regulations is that they are responsible and can make decisions related to the allocation of resources. Okay. So just be, I just kind of bring that up from that other perspective. When we're thinking about, this is an area of need that's been identified. Are we actually addressing that? And how do we know whether or not the student is making progress? That's that continuum. Oh yeah, and Gianna, I see your comment. Yeah, I was just making, yes, sometimes those types of skills can be addressed by other professionals. I just know that SLPs do that as well. So Sarah, I think I'm turning it back over to you, right?
I think you have a couple more, but I can move it. I can go from here if you want. That makes sense. So we're going to talk about writing goals now.
Oh, it was me. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Do you want to take the first couple, or do you want me to?
They've heard enough from me. Why don't you take the first couple slides? We'll switch back and then we'll go from there.
No problem. So we're going to talk a little bit about writing goals and the relationships between standards and goals, which I know comes up all of the time. Excuse me. So goals should be written to ensure that students have access to and progress in grade level standards. And if you remember back to our very first slide and our very first knowledge check, this is right there in that IDEA statutes and regulations language. So just some questions and things to consider. Why should I consider using grade level content standards to help me write my student goals? Content standards are already tied to general education curriculum and often help, excuse me, I apologize. Help special educators provide clearer guidance on what instruction should look like for a student. And teams should not feel the need to rely solely on standards to write goals. Goals should be ambitious. And so remember when we talked a little bit about Andrew, about really realistically calculated, but also ambitious, right? Tied to the individual student's needs and help the student access the general education curriculum when appropriate. So really, these are just sort of three components for you to remember to think about as you're really remembering the relationships between standards and goals. This can get really tricky when we're talking about students that are performing really far below sort of grade level standards, or are multiple grade levels below, and how do we continue to strive towards ambitious goals and the relationships between standards and goals. So just a reminder and some sort of interesting guiding questions for you to continue to think about as you write your goals. And Teri put in some information about a webinar and places you can find some more information about that. So common questions required to be answered in an IEP. What does the student need to know or be able to do, right? How will progress towards this goal be measured, right? Excuse me. And so then that's something that we have to include as we develop our IEP goals. What do they need to know? What should they be able to do? And how are we going to know that we're getting there? How are we going to measure this? What valid and reliable tools are we going to use? What mechanisms are we going to use that are going to drive us to getting there? So what's our goal? What's our data? And then what are our kind of common pitfalls? So one of them, and Teri already kind of got to this in giving her example, is that our goals don't align with the areas identified by our PLAS statement, our present levels, or we called them plops when I was teaching, but present levels, you've probably called them all kinds of things, right? But only address a small part. So maybe there's some that are leveled, or we sort of, and we've seen these in, it's more common in really old IEPs, but we often will see a really lovely present level statement or PLAF statement, and then these sort of standardized plug-in goals that come out of sometimes a computer program, or sometimes there's a we'll see districts or sometimes teachers get in this sort of habit of like, these are just the goals I like to write. And so they're very standardized, like, this is the way I write a reading goal, this is the way I write a mathematics goal. Sort of they're plugged in and they don't really match the very customized present level statements that we see per student. So that's a really common pitfall that we see, a mismatch between those. We also see this progress measured by observational trials or anecdotal notes. We see that in present levels. We also see that in just sort of measure the way that we measure progress towards goals. Data is not easily interpreted for responsiveness. We see a lot of things in present levels, like John's a really nice student. He's really compliant. He comes to class, the stuff like that, where we're not talking about sort of really data or things that are truly measurable. We also see goals written in a way, and if you remember, it's sort of those guiding questions that we talked about earlier, written in a way that they can actually be measured. Right. And so we talk, sometimes we call this like the Anchorman method of measurable goals. Like he'll do this 65% of the time, 95% of the time, sort of goals written like that. And so we want them to be written in a way that they can be measured, some not by sort of anecdotal methods, but really sort of in a way that allows us to measure them with valid, reliable data. So some tips for goal setting: select a target and measure. And earlier in the chat, somebody almost put word for word sort of these steps, which I appreciated. Establish a baseline. We've talked about this. Choose a strategy and write a measurable goal. So we're going to talk a bit about these as we move forward here. So how do we make this feasible with a valid and reliable progress monitoring tool? I know a lot of times folks really struggle with understanding using progress monitoring tools as a way to monitor IEP goals. And sometimes we see this as a pitfall, and I didn't list it in that previous slide, but sometimes what we'll see is kids receive progress monitoring all the way in tier 2 and tier 3. They get identified, they're eligible for special education, they go into receiving special education services, they have an IEP, and then progress monitoring stops. They're not progress monitored anymore. That's not always the case, but sometimes we see that. And so what we're here to tell you is that absolutely students on IEPs should absolutely still continue to receive progress monitoring. Often this data should be collected frequently, probably the most frequently of kids in your building. Same with kids that have intensive needs. But really we want to suggest that in order to make an IEP feasible, something that you can measure, something that's not just measured with sort of this anecdotal, observational sort of data, is that, it's done with a measurable goal that's comparable to baseline, that you collect data using a progress monitoring tool frequently, allowing your educators, your teachers, your interventionists, whoever is supporting the student, the vast number of folks that really support kids with disabilities, to determine if a student is responding to the instruction, the services that are part of this education program that they're receiving, that we graph the data, allowing special educators, related service providers, speech therapists, social workers, all of the people that these students really interact with throughout their day, visual data for quarterly progress updates. Also, this is really helpful for the kids themselves, students themselves, parents, and all of sort of the stakeholders that are invested in the progress of these students. And really it allows flexibility if needs change over time. So if you have a student on an IEP that you are not using a progress monitoring tool to sort of measure their progress, you're not graphing that data, I would suggest that that's hopefully one thing you leave with today, is that you take away from this is like, oh, we really need to start progress monitoring our students on IEPs. So essential elements of goal writing, that's kind of a, I want to make sure I don't skip over that too quickly. Any questions or comments, anything else to add to that, Teri, before I move us forward?
No, I think the other piece here is, and I'm coming kind of from the behavioral side of things, is we tend to see more measurability on the academic area and more alignment with progress monitoring goals in the academic area. And then when it comes to behavior, we start to get into those muddy waters. And so I think that, just identifying some of the valid and reliable tools that you can be using for the behavioral domain, as well as those functional skills, is also critical. So something like direct behavior rating, if you're not familiar with it, the National Center on Intensive Intervention, we have a lot of resources. And actually, if anybody was at CEC and you still have access to the platform, myself, Chris Riley Tillman, and Faith Miller did a session on behavioral goals, and I'll post a couple resources too, and we'll share the resources at the end where some of those guidance documents are, but just wanted to kind of point that out as well. The other thing that I'll say is oftentimes we feel like we're rushing to pull together our present levels, our goal statements. I know when I was a social worker and I would have to do my quarterly progress updates, right? You have to put those in. And I'd be sitting there trying to like dig through stacks of check in, check out point cards or something else. I wish that when I was in practice, I would have been using something like the direct behavior rating. And all I would have needed to do was pull in the graph that shows, look, here is on paper how your student, how your child is making progress toward this goal, right? I think oftentimes we think about data collection as being a burden as opposed to a benefit to us in terms of really addressing and making sure that we are able to show our obligations of meeting that substantive requirement. And so I point that out because I've heard things like, well, if we're spending too much time in data collection, then we don't have enough time in instruction. Progress monitoring is intended to be brief, repeated measures. We're not looking at something that's cumbersome or going to take 15, 20, 35 minutes to administer every time. We're looking at something that's brief. And so just be thinking about those brief measures that you can be getting over a repeated time period that, as Sarah mentioned, you can graph, right? So that you are clearly articulating where's my goal and then be able to, be able to kind of really show that you're meeting that substantive requirement, that they are actually making progress. And it's not just my gut telling me that.
Yeah, that's right. We also deal with teachers and folks sort of tolerability of behaviors and things like that, which sometimes impacts tracking of behavior goals. So, we want to make sure that we're using a reliable tool for that. Teri, do you mind putting the link to the NCII tools charts in the chat? I didn't put it in there because I'm sharing my screen. A couple of you have either private messaged me or asked in the chat about suggestions for progress monitoring tools. And the National Center on Intensive Intervention has some tools charts where we rate the evidence available around progress monitoring and assessment tools. It is not an area where we promote the tools charts, but we look through, or we promote assessment tools, but we look through and sort of give you information about progress monitoring and screening tools. We outline sort of the usability features of them, what is the evidence behind them, and things like that. So, and then the TIE Center, Teri put in a link for that too. So if you're looking for a progress monitoring tool, information about what could be used, we'll give you some resources for those things too, and Teri will put those in the chat. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but there's some essential elements of goal writing, some things you need to think about. So the condition in which this work will happen, the target behavior, like what do we want to happen, right? The level of proficiency, so the timeline in which it will happen. And then here's, if you'll notice in this blue box over here, it's reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress, enable of the child's circumstances. Bonus points if you know where that came from, but I'm hoping you recognize that as language that came right out of Andrew, right? So we've got this little formula. So if we take condition, target behavior, and level of proficiency, right, plus this reasonably calculated, that should give us a measurable goal, right? These are the essential functions of an IEP goal, is really just to set out a plan, right? To set out an IEP, set out a plan for pursuing academic and functional achievement. So quick tips for writing measurable annual goals. There on the right-hand side of the slide is an IEP tip sheet that lays these out. At the end of this slide, there's a link to that, and we're going to go through some resources. I know Teri's putting a number of these in the chat as well, but there is a link to this at the end. So we've talked about this already, but start with the academic and our functional needs identified in the PLAF statement. We can't kind of talk about this enough. These need to connect, right? You don't want to have a present level that then doesn't connect to your goals. If you think back to some slides we showed you earlier, there was multiple boxes with an arrow behind them. That's sort of to indicate to you that all of these things are sort of a path to getting to progress, a path to getting to outcomes. And if your PLAF doesn't connect to your goals, doesn't connect to your services, doesn't connect to your instruction, right? You're not going to get to the sort of ultimate outcomes for kids. We're going to have sort of these this mishmash of approaches, but we're not really going to get to where we need to head. We'd really like you to select a validated goal setting approach, really have these three essential elements: the condition or context, the target behavior, and the level of performance. So we're going to talk more about those specific things in a minute. And then this next one is really important, and we haven't talked about it too much yet, but use brief, specific, and clear language that's easily understood by all IEP team members. I don't know how many of you have received IEPs from either out of district, sometimes even from a different school in your own district, or from out of state, and you've picked it up and been like, there's literally no way I could implement this. I do not know what this means. I was a special ed teacher for about a decade, and I can't tell you how many times I got IEPs where I'm like, we just have to completely start over. I don't know what to do. I don't even know what this student maybe struggles with, is strong at, what the skills are, things like that, because I'm confused, right? Also remember who is encompassed in this term: IEP team members. These are parents, potentially community members, family members, adult caregivers, everyone that's invested in the outcomes for this student. This is also the student, right? We want everyone involved in an understanding sort of what is involved in the language of goals. And that means we need to have really clear, really specific language so everyone knows where we're going, right? And then use language that ensures student progress can be measured. So again, trying to stay away from this sort of murky, anecdotal, observable, maybe on a good day sort of language, and really sort of clear, concise, measurable language in an IEP goal. So here's some considerations for IEP goals. I'm going to give you a little heads up. There's going to be a quiz in a minute. So for those of you that are competitive or really like to get the answers right, you might want to pay attention. So considerations for goals. Academic goals, again, we're focusing on that. But yes, of course, functional, behavioral, all those goals are critical to high quality programs for all kids with disabilities. Academic goals, in this case, help kids, students access and benefit from instruction in general education aligned with standards. So here's a draft goal. Jessie will read 65 words per minute. I hope that many of you will know and will be saying that is probably not a very good goal, right? So this goal describes a target behavior, right? But is missing the condition and the level of proficiency, right? Or the time frame. We don't know when he's going to do this, or she. We don't know the condition. We don't know those things, right? And so here's a revised version of said goal. Given a second grade reading probe, Jessie will read 65 words correctly in 1 minute with 95% accuracy on 3 consecutive probes. We're pretty clear. We're fairly concise. We're definitely measurable, right? This is a much better version of this first goal, right? Jessie will read 65 words per minute, right? So again, remember, we've got these components here: condition, target behavior, level of proficiency, right? So on the left-hand side, we've got these 3 things. The condition may include the material, the tool, the grade level, the setting, the timing, right? So here's some examples. When given 30 first grade sight words, when given the verbal prompt, this is what they're going to do, right? Or what they're going to use: the material, the tool, the grade level, the setting, the condition in which they're operating. The target behavior is really what they're going to do, the observable behavior or the target goal. The student will read 30 sight words. The student will ask for help. The student will. And then the level of proficiency, right? And what will they do, right? The accuracy, the timeline, the number of trials with 95% accuracy, with 80% accuracy. I would encourage you to really, if you're going to go back and look at your goals, look at your level of proficiency in your goals and make sure that's actually measurable. A lot of times we see goals written with a really sort of odd, like we just throw in like 80% accuracy, but you find out like that's not actually, we can't actually measure the accuracy that we put in. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head, and Teri, if you can think of one. Sometimes we'll see like the student will ask to go to the restroom with 80% accuracy. Like we'll see stuff like that written for behavioral goals or things like that, where like it was a night, we need the student to ask to do that because they've normally just been running out of the classroom instead of asking, right? So that's a good goal, but like 80% accuracy is maybe not the level of proficiency, the right measure of that. So go back and double check that, because sometimes we see sort of strange levels of proficiency. Yeah, 80% of the time, or just go back and double check. Sometimes we see some funny levels of proficiency. Also remember that sometimes with behavior goals, we don't want increases, we want decreases. And sometimes we see that inadvertently thrown in there, depending on the behavior, of course, always.
The other thing I'll say about behavior goals, though, especially in terms of if you really want to make sure that you're able to measure progress, is really focusing on the replacement behavior that you're teaching. That's really where we should be focusing our annual goals, right? Yes, we want decreases in specific behaviors if it's a problematic behavior, but we want to make sure that we are teaching that student the skill that they need to be successful in decreasing those behaviors. So what we talk about in the behavior guide, and I posted it already in a link from NCII, is really thinking about you can still collect data on those problematic behaviors. You can still collect that as part of your just ongoing understanding. But when you're thinking about writing your goal, focus it on the replacement behavior that you are teaching, because what that does is it sets you up for success when you then need to identify the services that you're going to provide to that kid. It's harder for us to use a goal, and this gets back to kind of the purpose of this session as well, is to think about that connection between your goal and your instruction. It's hard to identify what your instruction is going to be in behavior or academics if your goal's not written in a way that's going to help you understand it. So focusing in on the replacement behavior in your IEP is a really nice way to make a strong connector between your present level. We have this area of need, we have the baseline, we've set our measurable annual goal, and now from there, we can determine the services and supports that we can put into place for this kid, right? I know that by focusing on the replacement behavior, I have to teach that replacement behavior. That's my instruction, right? That's how we use the goal to help us do it, as opposed to saying the student's going to decrease this problematic behavior, but it's not really helping us articulate what we're going to do to teach them how to do that. So we can still, as I mentioned before, still collect data on that problematic behavior, because it may be that we identified the wrong function and we have to go back and re-examine that replacement behavior or some of the antecedent strategies or things that we're putting into place as far as how we're supporting that kid. But I just bring that up.
Yeah, thanks, Teri. So as promised, here's a little knowledge check for those of you, and this will be our last one. So the following is an example of an academic goal. Which elements are missing, or which element is missing from the goal? Select all that apply. So it could just be one, could be multiple. So again, if it's multiple, put in all the letters. If it's one, just put in the letter. So here's the goal. When given a sheet of 10 single-digit multiplication problems, the student will calculate the problems accurately. Are we missing the condition, the target behavior, the level of proficiency, or all elements are missing? So all elements are present. Remember, we're asking which element is missing. Lots of right answers on this one. So very good. The conditions here, right? So A is there, right? When given a sheet of 10 single-digit multiplication problems, so we have the condition. The target behavior is here, right? We know what the student will do. The student will calculate the problems, right? And so because we know that A and B are there, we already know that D is not going to be the answer. So C, the level of proficiency is the piece that's missing, right? We don't know the time frame or the level of accuracy. We just know that they will calculate the problems accurately, but we don't have the level of proficiency or the time frame. So nice work. Lots of right answers on that one. Good job. So just a reminder, last slide from me, and then I'm going to pass it over to Teri to do some closing and some resources for you all. But There's a sort of a corrected example. When given a sheet of 10 single-digit multiplication problems, student will calculate the problems with at least 85% accuracy on 3 consecutive weekly progress monitoring probes. So just a rewritten potential example given with a level of proficiency or time frame element. So as we've talked about earlier, your goals should focus on your student behavior, not your educator behavior, right? What we want the students to do. It should be monitored with enough frequency to determine progress and make timely instructional intervention decisions. They shouldn't just be monitored quarterly when you have to send home those progress reports or, whatever. We really want to know when those go home. We should be able to have really regularly updates of data and graph data and know at any given time, should someone walk into your classroom and say, how's this student doing? You should be able to say, well, here's my graphed data on all these goals or on this progress or things like that. Really, we want to know, how is the student responding to this high quality program across the board that we're delivering and that we've developed for them. They should be measured using objective, valid, and reliable measures, right? So there's that direct behavior rating listed there that Teri mentioned earlier, using reliable and valid progress monitoring tools rather than more subjective measures. So teacher anecdotal notes, observational measures, the old piece of Scotch tape on your leg with sort of tack marks with a pencil. Some people may remember that, things like that. We really want them to be realistic, right? We want to set realistic goals, things that are achievable, but also ambitious goals. So we don't want to set goals that are so ambitious, kids aren't obtaining them and we're never making progress on them. But we really want ambitious goals for our students, really calculated in light of their disability, but also ambitious enough that we're pushing them to make progress. So I'm going to pass it over to Teri just to close and provide some additional resources.
Yep, and feel free if you've got any questions or thoughts, or if there's specific things that you're looking for in terms of resources, just add them to the chat box as well. And we can go ahead and do our best to point you into a couple of places. So I've already posted these resources. They are the National Center on Intensive Intervention guides on academic IEP goals, as well as data-driven behavioral IEP goals. So you heard me mention that direct behavior rating. That is a focus in that behavior IEP goal, if that's a new term for you or a new way of measuring behavior. The other thing I will say is you can also use DBR to look at some of those functional performance domains as well, in terms of like self-advocacy skills and some of those other skills that we might be measuring that are a little bit more hard to measure, right? And so DBR, we explain it in there, and the center has done a number of webinars on that resource as well. Both resources, I should say. The other center that we'll point you to is the IRIS Center. If you're not familiar with IRIS, IRIS is a really great resource. They have a number of self-paced online modules that you can go to across a variety of topics related to just about any topic under the sun relationship to students with disabilities. So we've collaborated with them on a number of their resources, and they collaborate with us as our centers as well. So they have a specific module focused on measurable annual goals, as well as some of the processes for intensive intervention that NCII also talks about in their work. And we posted the tools charts, the links to the tools charts. I posted the link to the main page, which will take you to tools charts for various things. So this link on here says wants to learn more, and it just links you to the academic progress monitoring tools chart. In addition to the academic progress monitoring tools charts, there's also a behavior progress monitoring tools charts. There are charts for screening across academics and behavior, as well as interventions across academics and behavior. When we talk about intervention, we're talking about students that have typically tier 2 needs or need a standardized kind of intervention from which we can then further intensify supports for through our intensive intervention processes. So you can use any of those tools charts to kind of either help you identify progress monitoring tools or interventions for particular students. Again, the IRIS module is on here with the IEPs. So there's two. There's one focused on how to develop a high quality individualized education program, as well as one specific for administrators. What we found is, and what IRIS is really hoping to aim to do is really support administrators who may not have had as much in relationship to special education law and those types of things in their preparation. And so this module really gives a nice primer to what they should really be doing to support the implementation of high quality IEPs. That is about it as far as our content and our sources for more information. But if there are specific questions, I don't know if Brad, if people can come off mute, if they want to raise their hand, we're happy to stick around and answer questions.
Yes, please. If you have a question for Teri or Sarah, you can either drop it in the chat or raise your hand with reactions, or just turn on your camera and your mic and start speaking. Thank you guys so much.
And thanks to everyone for coming. There's a link, like Brad said, to the survey for feedback in the chat. So we'd appreciate any feedback that you have. And there's lots of resources linked in the chat as well that we put in there. So we appreciate your attendance today. Thank you so much.